Irashaimase. Hello and welcome to Fataris' Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fataris. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this week we have Battle Station's Blockade, an arcadey rail shooter. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. From developer Mission Critical Studios, Battle Station's Blockade released in December of 2023 for the PC, the Xbox, the PlayStation 4 and 5, and the Nintendo Switch, which is the version we're looking at today. This is a title I had high expectations going into. I loved the presentation, that whole voxel-based look that the game has, and I was looking forward to what seemed to be an enjoyable rail shooter. Unfortunately, I was let down as the game just kind of becomes this long, drawn-out, monotonous slugfest. So, it's not one that I would recommend. However, let's dive into the gameplay itself, and if this is something that you do think is interesting to you, I would suggest waiting for a sale. It does go on sale fairly frequently, so keep that in mind. Here we find ourselves at the main menu. There's 3 game modes we can potentially play. There's the campaign mode, where you'll play through the individual missions in order, unlocking them as you go, and then we have 2 co-op modes, or rather 2 player modes. There's the co-op mode where you're both competing, or rather you're working together to build up a score, and then head-to-head where you're competing for high score. For our purposes today, we're going to be showing off the game in co-op play. Selecting co-op play, we're taken to the levels, and the game does have a fair number of stages. However, these stages are extremely long, and that's where some of the problem is they just become dull and tedious. We'll go ahead and pick In Disguise to show off the gameplay itself. Initially, if you're starting the game from the beginning in the campaign, you'll have a fairly short tutorial from this commanding officer you've got here, but at the beginning of each stage he gives a brief explanation of what's going on. So in this case we're going to be having to deal with air assets, and with that ship's speed dialed up, we're underway. So in Battle Station's Blockade, you have 2 turrets on the front of the ship. If you're playing the game single player, you'll be controlling both turrets that'll be firing at a single reticule. So on a Switch controller, you fire with the right trigger, and the left trigger does allow you to select between a number of different weapons. Initially, we start with a 50 caliber machine gun equipped, and really this is the weapon I feel is the best in the game, and that's largely just due to its high rate of fire. All the other weapons have significantly slower rates of fire, and with as many enemies as we're dealing with on a regular basis, it just doesn't make sense to use the others. You'll be falling further behind rather than actually getting ahead with how slow those weapons fire. As we defeat enemies, you might notice that there's pop-ups for health that come up above them. So this game has an insane amount of unavoidable damage. We are taking enemy fire constantly. There's enemies that pop up on land that will even be shooting at you before you have the chance to react to them being on screen, missiles that fly at you from screen, and there's even been a couple situations where we've noticed enemies that have been off screen that have been shooting us, or even shooting us around terrain. Things just aren't fair. So how does the game balance this? By having every single enemy we defeat restore our health. Our health bars are located on the backs of the turret, so that green bar in the middle of the turret itself, that's our health. If we were to take enough damage, you would see that decrease, but as we are constantly defeating enemies, it's replenishing. There are some other scoring mechanics present. So each section of the stage, you have these various objectives you need to complete, like defeating X number of jets, or shooting down a number of paratroopers, or planes, certain kinds of boats, that sort of thing, and those will help net you points. There is also some comboing that goes on, but I'm not 100% sure of the particular timing of that comboing. So when you go to switch weapons, there's also an interesting problem that you encounter when you're playing in 2-player. You'll pop up this menu for the weapon selection, and there's quite a few weapons available. There's 9 different weapons you can choose between. However, a lot of them, as I mentioned, aren't particularly useful, and when you have this screen open, if you're playing 2-player, the second player does not have the ability to fire. You do have some fun choices though, like there's this nuke launcher where you have this like slow nuke that once it hits, it does have a very large explosion radius. However, it takes quite a while for that to refill. On the left and right of the screen, you can see the reload gauge for the individual weapon that you're firing. As you can see, this one takes quite a while to refresh. It does do significant damage, but it's hard to aim and plan for with that slow rate of fire. There's also this like scatter gun, which you don't really see the shots, but it's basically acting as a shotgun. This is my second favorite from the main gun, the 50 caliber machine gun, as it acts as like a short range like shotgun that does do a good job of taking out a lot of enemies when they're close to the ship. So keep that in mind. And that's basically it for the gameplay mechanics of Battle Stations Blockade. And the stages just continue like this, with the enemies continually pelting us and us replenishing health for an exceedingly long period of time. The stages just drag on, and although there are a lot of enemies, there's a lot of action, at the same time I don't feel like there's enough variety to it. It gets repetitive very, very quickly. It could have really benefited from having shorter stages with more like thoughtful interactions put into play. And even the building up of score is like kind of negated by the fact that it doesn't have an online leaderboard. It's just like local, at least for the Nintendo Switch version. I can't speak for the others. So there you have it, Battle Stations Blockade served up for your enjoyment. As I mentioned in the beginning, this is not a title that I can go and recommend. I was sorely disappointed by the gameplay itself, though I must say I do still really appreciate the look. So as far as the minus flavors are concerned, the biggest problem is that the stages are just too long. They're dull and repetitive, and when you're playing a game like this and the first thing that you're, or well, not necessarily the first thing you're saying, but when you're saying like, okay, is this the end of the stage? Is this the end of the stage now? Are we there yet? That's never a good sign for any game, let alone an arcadey shoot 'em up. Also, there's not really much in the way of music for the game at all, so for the most part you just have the sound effects of the enemy shots coming at you, as well as the cannons just firing constantly. So if this was a game you were going to play, maybe have your own soundtrack or podcast to listen to, but that's also something that kind of doesn't help build up the energy that the game itself has. And then that whole problem where we've got enemies just like constantly firing at us and being unable to prevent that damage, as they'll be shooting at us even before we, like in some cases, know that they're there, is just, it's frustrating. Another thing, the game does have multiple difficulty settings. It starts out on like the lowest by default, but if you turn it up, the way that it's increasing the difficulty is by increasing the damage the enemies deal to you, making it significantly easier to die, and as such, just more frustrating. But on the plus flavor side, I do really love this like voxel presentation. I would have loved to have seen this game like actually been more enjoyable than the time that I've had with it so far, as I just love the way that it looks. Like the ship's cannons in the beginning, like some of the enemy ships that we like fight, like in this stage, there's of course the submarines, but we also have the battleships, there's carriers, there's other like big bosses that I think are wonderful from a presentation standpoint. It's just ultimately like the gameplay itself where this falls flat. And then you also have the fact that I just love a good rail shooter, so I do enjoy the rail shooter aspect of it. It's just all the other things bring it down enough that it's not a title that I can really recommend, or that I've really had all that much of a good time with. Well, that'll just about wrap it up for this week's episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, I want to thank you so much for joining us this week. I hope you have a wonderful week yourself, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.